The 1973 Northern Ireland Constitution Act was to lead to a conflict of loyalties within the Unionist community. From now on, nationalists were to be given a say in the running of the country, but so too was the Southern government. Less than a year after the army appeared on the streets of Belfast, old issues and animosities were being paraded in full public view. The Provisional IRA's bombing campaign had begun, and as hostilities increased, the British government insisted on taking over security policy. The Northern Ireland Premier, Brian Faulkner, was summoned to London on the 24th of March 1972. Here, the head of the Conservative government, Edward Heath, informed Faulkner that he intended transferring control of security policy to Westminster. On his return to Belfast, Faulkner and his cabinet resigned. 50 years of Unionist rule ended on the 28th of March 1972. The day the Stormont Parliament met for the last time, a huge column of Unionists converged on the drive. This was the second day of a protest strike called by the vanguard leader William Craig on the abolition of Stormont. The strike interrupted power supplies, closed down businesses and stopped public transport.
That we, in our endeavour to provide just government in Ulster, have been betrayed from London.
The Provisional IRA saw the introduction of direct rule as a victory for nationalists. More importantly, it highlighted what the Provisionals saw as the real cause of the northern conflict: continued domination of the island by a colonial power. For that reason, it decided that its campaign would not be called off. IRA destruction reached new heights on the 14th of April 1972, when 30 bombs exploded in different parts of Northern Ireland, a clear signal of intent to the British government's new man in charge.
What we have tried to do is to present the people of Northern Ireland with an opportunity, a chance to
ultimate power in Northern Ireland now rested in the hands of a new political supremo, the Secretary of State, William Whitelaw. He believed that direct rule from Westminster would be a temporary measure, a chance for a new beginning in Northern Ireland. The British government's policy of engaging nationalists in any future government of Northern Ireland was to bring it into direct confrontation with the loyalist community. When William Whitelaw took over, he removed the ban on all marches and released a number of internees. In June, after a hunger strike in Crumlin Road prison, Whitelaw gave in to demands for special category status to IRA prisoners. These measures were introduced partly in preparation for secret meetings with the Provisional IRA. Behind the scenes, Whitelaw's men were already meeting the Provisionals to negotiate an end to their campaign of violence. The ceasefire was called on the 26th of June. 11 days after the ceasefire began, members of the Provisional IRA were flown to London for talks with the Secretary of State. The meeting took place here at Cheney Walk, in the home of Paul Channon, a junior government minister. At the meeting, the IRA demanded a British withdrawal from Ireland within 3 years and an amnesty for what it called all prisoners of war. Whitelaw could not accept this, and the talks came to an abrupt end. Within 2 days, the ceasefire was called off. A fortnight after the failed talks in London, the IRA detonated 26 bombs within an hour around the centre of Belfast. 11 people were killed and 130 injured in what became known as Bloody Friday. After Bloody Friday, Whitelaw was put under increasing pressure to take control of Republican no-go areas in Derry and Belfast. The IRA operated as a law unto itself within these areas. Their continued existence angered the Loyalist community, which set up its own no-go areas in protest. At the end of July 1972, Operation Motorman got underway. The army met little resistance as it moved in to dismantle the barricades and retake control of nationalist no-go areas in Derry and Belfast. Catholic and Protestant no-go areas in Belfast were taken over with as much ease as in Derry. Despite the scale of the operation, troops failed to capture any IRA members in a series of house searches. On the political front, Whitelaw was now searching for an agreed form of government for Northern Ireland. Round-table talks were held in Darlington at the end of September 1972. The Unionist, Alliance and Northern Ireland Labour parties took part, but the SDLP refused to attend while internment was still in operation. What came out of Darlington surprised nationalists and would draw the SDLP back into negotiations. From the talks, the government produced a discussion paper. It insisted that the province would remain part of the United Kingdom for as long as the people of Northern Ireland wished, but it added, "There are strong arguments that the objective of real participation should be achieved by giving minority interests a share in the exercise of executive power." In effect, the government in London was calling for power sharing, but it wasn't prepared to use the term. More ominously, from a unionist perspective, the document also introduced the idea of an Irish dimension, when it went on to say that any new arrangements for Northern Ireland should be, so far as is possible, acceptable to and accepted by the Republic of Ireland. This new departure in the British government's approach caused considerable concern in unionist circles. The Orange Order, the Ulster Defence Association and the extreme Vanguard and Democratic Unionist parties rejected this idea out of hand. As part of its new way forward, Britain held a referendum in March the following year to allow the people of Northern Ireland to decide whether they wished to remain in the United Kingdom. The SDLP called for a nationalist boycott, and the outcome was an overwhelming vote in favour of maintaining the Union. On the 20th of March 1973, the British government issued its plans for the future government of Northern Ireland. What was proposed was a new assembly with 78 members, which would eventually take over the running of the country, but security policy was to remain in Westminster's control. The chairmen of the assembly committees would form an executive, in effect a new Northern Ireland cabinet. The government in London also insisted that the executive had to represent the two communities in Northern Ireland, and so introduced the idea of power sharing. More controversially, the government expressed a desire that the new arrangements would prove acceptable to the Irish government. Britain further envisaged a Council of Ireland, an idea first put forward at Westminster over 50 years earlier by Lloyd George. It was to be a cross-border body, dealing with issues of mutual concern. The test for the British government's plans came at the Assembly elections in June 1973. Brian Faulkner, the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, was prepared to give power sharing a chance.
This vote today is the basis of what it's all been about. The IRA, the people before them who organised riots, were doing it all just to try to show the world that Northern Ireland was oppressed, beleaguered, held down by force of arms. And to Democrats, nothing is more convincing than the ballot box.
The ballot box on this occasion revealed a deepening split within unionism. A majority of unionists were opposed to the new assembly. But the combined votes of Faulkner's pro-assembly unionists and the other Northern Ireland parties indicated to William Whitelaw that there was majority support for power sharing and the Council of Ireland. The situation changed dramatically as the idea of a Council of Ireland became more significant. Liam Cosgrave's Dublin government shared Britain's views on the Council in any settlement. Cosgrave's government had also seen the Council as playing a minor role, but after a series of deputations from the SDLP, it changed its position. By September 1973, the coalition government in the south was looking for an increased status for the Council of Ireland and stressed the importance of the Irish dimension in any agreement on Northern Ireland. What had been intended as a small part of an overall solution within Northern Ireland was taking on much wider significance. At the photo call on Thursday, the 22nd of November 1973, the new power-sharing executive made its first appearance. It was made up of 6 Faulknerite unionists, 4 members of the nationalist SDLP and 1 Alliance Party member. Brian Faulkner was the chief executive. His deputy, Jerry Fitt, was the leader of the Nationalist Party.
What are you doing with that? Take those James away at once.
Ian Paisley's DUP and William Craig's Vanguard were so opposed to the new executive that their members attacked power-sharing unionists at the Stormont Parliament a few days after the photo call and had to be escorted from the chamber by members of the RUC.
The Constitutional Act says that no executive can be formed except it is widely accepted in the community. Would you be fool enough to say that this Constitution Act is widely accepted in this community when it took 40 armoured cars and 1,000 army men and police to do what they did today?
Grassroots loyalists rejected power sharing and the Council of Ireland from the outset. On the 6th of December, Paisley's DUP, Craig's Vanguard and the Orange Order formed an alliance called the United Ulster Unionist Council to oppose what they saw as a betrayal of the Union. The same day, Faulkner's executive was in Sunningdale in England discussing Northern Ireland's future relations with Britain and the Republic of Ireland. None of the Assembly members opposed to the Council of Ireland was invited. This was the first conference in 47 years that the heads of the British, Irish and Northern Ireland governments sat down together. Francis Pym had been appointed the new Secretary of State for Northern Ireland by the British Prime Minister Edward Heath just 4 days before the conference. Agreement on the need for a Council of Ireland was finally reached on Sunday the 9th of December. As the British and Irish governments signed the Sunningdale Agreement, Brian Faulkner believed that the Council would be merely an advisory body and nothing that had to be feared by unionists. The first major threat to the power-sharing executive was posed by the man who had helped set it up. Edward Heath called a surprise general election for the 28th of February 1974. In Britain, the main issues were the miners' strike, inflation and rising prices. In Northern Ireland, the only issue that mattered was the Sunningdale Agreement. The Westminster election was to be a referendum on power sharing and the Council of Ireland, and loyalist opinion on both was undivided. The general election result was a disaster for the pro-Sunningdale parties. They competed against each other for votes in each constituency. The Treble UC, however, put forward only one candidate in each of the 12 constituencies. In South Belfast, for example, the combined votes of Faulkner's candidate and the other parties standing could have meant victory for the pro-Assembly and pro-Sunningdale parties. That day, Treble UC candidates won 11 of the 12 Westminster seats. The only exception was West Belfast, where the leader of the SDLP, Jerry Fitt, won. Loyalist reaction to his victory was loudly hostile. The executive still had majority support within the Northern Ireland Assembly, but after the Westminster elections, the Assembly could no longer claim to represent the views of the vast majority of Unionists. The Westminster election caused a change of government in London. The new Labour Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, appointed Merlin Rees as his Secretary of State. On the day he arrived in Northern Ireland, the IRA planted bombs in Belfast, Coal Island and Downpatrick. Rees gave Faulkner and the power-sharing executive his full backing. Support from London was reinforced when Wilson visited Northern Ireland later in the year. As far as he was concerned, there was no alternative to the Sunningdale Agreement. The Assembly finally ratified the Sunningdale Agreement on the 14th of May 1974. This was after a period of intense debate on the Council of Ireland. But by this stage, support was passing from the ruling executive to the Treble UC. Waiting outside Parliament that day were members of the Ulster Workers Council. It represented loyalist workers from the country's key industries. Its chairman was Harry Murray. When he found out that the vote had gone in favour of the Sunningdale Agreement and the Council of Ireland, Murray announced the start of a loyalist strike that would bring the country to a standstill and force the issue onto the streets.
We're prepared to go right to the end, even if the people of Northern Ireland will have to do with 1 meal a day and right till no meal a day.
The UWC general stoppage began the following day, Wednesday the 15th of May, but the response to the strike call was slow. It was obvious that the UWC did not have an effective strategy in place. It was relying on a small number of organisers in crucial industries, the most important being the power station workers. By the afternoon, most of Northern Ireland had experienced 4-hour-long power cuts. That morning, members of the strike committee, the Ulster Defence Association and the Ulster Volunteer Force met at strike headquarters at Hawthornden Road. The loyalist paramilitaries insisted that intimidation would have to be used to make the strike effective. That afternoon, the UDA, UVF and other members of the paramilitary umbrella group, the Ulster Army Council, issued a statement ordering loyalists to stop work immediately. By the end of the first day, many people had left work because they were forced home out of fright or because there was little power to keep the production lines going. By Friday of the first week, the stoppage was all but complete. By now, long food queues had become a common sight. Loyalists were prepared to face any hardship to ensure an end to the power-sharing executive.
I've no heating, I've no cooking, but it doesn't bother me.
What about food? Have you got plenty of that?
I've got plenty of food, yes.
But as the strike goes on, it gets more difficult to get food. I mean, you're all housewives. What's your reaction going to be?
We'll eat grass.
We are the people. Who are these people? We are the people.
Are you not making life more difficult for yourself?
Yes, but we don't mind because the end justifies the means.
During the first 3 days, there were allegations of widespread intimidation. However, for Glenn Barr, the chairman of the Strike Coordinating Committee, what was happening on the streets represented the will of the majority.
We represent the people. It's not enforced control or enforced power. the people throughout the province have given us this power to exercise on their behalf.
As the UWC tightened its grip on the country, Merlin Rees was having his own difficulties at Stormont. He'd spent all day Friday trying to resolve differences between the SDLP and Brian Faulkner's unionists on the final shape of a Council of Ireland. But the centre of attention was to shift abruptly later that afternoon from Belfast to Dublin. Early on Friday evening, news came through to the Northern Ireland office of explosions in Dublin. 3 car bombs had gone off during the rush hour. No warning was given and 22 people were killed. Just over an hour later, another car bomb exploded in Monaghan, killing 5 people. The 3 cars used in the Dublin bombing had been hijacked in Belfast and the Monaghan car in Portadown. The UDA and UVF both denied responsibility for the explosions. Allegations were made later that British Secret Services had planted the bombs. On Sunday of the first week, the UWC called for an all-out stoppage because of the Secretary of State's refusal to meet them. By now, Northern Ireland was experiencing 12-hour-long electricity blackouts, and petrol supplies were being strictly controlled by the strike committee. The British government was quickly losing control of the situation. Merlin Rees declared a state of emergency. Despite an initial reluctance, the Treble UC leadership of William Craig, Harry West and Ian Paisley, with the Orange Order, had declared their full support for the UWC strike. On Monday, the 20th of May, Rees issued an ultimatum to the executive to treat as a matter of urgency what it was going to do about the Council of Ireland. For weeks now, the executive had been arguing about what powers it should have. The SDLP knew that the powers of the council would have to be significantly reduced for it to be acceptable to Faulkner. If he rejected it, then the executive would collapse, and all the gains they had made on power sharing would be lost. Tuesday saw the failure of a back-to-work march led by Len Murray, the leader of the trade union movement in Britain.
What about the opposition being voiced across the road at the moment? Does that concern you at all?
It concerns me because it shows an unawareness that the right to work is a basic human right. And it concerns me too because it's some evidence that the intimidation which I've heard of is what is really stopping people from going to work.
The 200 people who had turned up for the march were jeered and attacked by a hostile group of onlookers. Murray had failed to realise that he was not dealing with an ordinary trade union strike. This was a popular movement totally opposed to what was quickly becoming a puppet government. As Brian Faulkner addressed the Assembly later in the afternoon, informing them of the worsening situation in Northern Ireland, there was a power cut which affected Parliament buildings. By now, the Ulster Workers Council was effectively operating as a provisional government within Northern Ireland. All week, members of the executive had been pressing for military action to crush the strike. On Saturday, the 25th of May, Rees held discussions with the power-sharing executive to decide whether the army should be used to operate selected petrol stations. No decision was taken. That night, Northern Ireland awaited a broadcast by the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. The UWC expected the worst, but Wilson's speech completely backfired on the power-sharing executive.
Over £300 million a year now, with the cost of the army operations on top of that. going into Northern Ireland. They see property destroyed by evil violence and are asked to pick up the bill for rebuilding it. Yet people who benefit from all this now viciously defy Westminster, purporting to act as though they were an elected government. People who spend their lives sponging on Westminster and British democracy and then systematically assault democratic methods. Who do these people think they are?
Wilson's speech provoked fury and incomprehension among unionists. It had the effect of uniting still further all the groups opposed to the power-sharing executive. Wilson also said in his speech that the British government would maintain essential services in Northern Ireland.
There's no doubt about it that those few words of Harold Wilson really set the seal.
By calling the strikers spongers, Wilson managed to insult and antagonize the entire loyalist population in one fell swoop. 2 days after the broadcast, the army moved in to take over 21 petrol stations across Northern Ireland. The UWC immediately stopped its supplies to 140 stations, and workers in the Belfast gas plant walked out. More barricades went up. The country was moving towards a total shutdown. On Tuesday, the 28th of May, talks between the SDLP and Faulkner's Unionist Party on the Council of Ireland broke down. That afternoon, Faulkner asked Rees to open dialogue with the strikers. He refused, and Faulkner's party resigned. The power-sharing executive was at an end, just as a demonstration by farmers was making its way up the drive, demanding the resignation of the executive. Little did the farmers realise that the UWC had already won. British policy in Northern Ireland had failed. Power-sharing had failed, and the Council of Ireland was rejected out of hand. When news of Faulkner's resignation broke, the Loyalist demonstration in front of Parliament buildings turned into a victory celebration.